A miracle is something that results from divine action breaking up the expected in our lives. A miracle is God's revelation of His will and power, breaking into and disrupting our expectations of the ordinary.
Okay, you keep referring to the signs. You know, many today in Pentecostal circles, when you think about healings, you also hear these two words, signs and wonders. Where does that come from? What does that mean? Even you were using the word sign. Give us a little bit of insight to where that comes from.
Yeah, miracles as signs or signs and wonders, it's language that we typically get from the book of Acts. Okay. But Luke may have been borrowing that from actually the Greek version of the Old Testament, which uses that phrase to explain the Exodus. So multiple times there's reference to the signs and wonders God did when He delivered you out of slavery. And the whole point is you got to remember. You got to remember what God has done. Or from the prophets like Joel, who promises signs and wonders in the heavens in the last days. So Luke uses this. Now the word sign is really just a word that can be used for one thing that represents another thing. In the Greek, it's sometimes used for like the shadow on a sundial, which represents the time, or in my favorite example, a beacon fire that represents a particular communication. You see the fire, but you know it also means this. In fact, this is the image that comes to mind. I'm going to nerd out one more time, just forgive me. One of my favorite movie scenes is from Lord of the Rings. And if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you just really should watch Lord of the Rings. But Lord of the Rings is where there is this scene at the last film. There's the Palace of Gondor. Gondor is a city that's in trouble, and they refuse to recognize that they need help. There is a beacon fire in the palace area that, if lit, will light up other fires along the way that will call for aid. And they refuse to do anything. So one of the hobbits, a young hobbit by the name of Pippin, he scales this long structure. He lights the fire while the guards are distracted. The fire is now fully lit. They can't put it out. And then you see at this far distant mountain that's still visible to this fire, another fire's lit. Because the people here saw that fire, they're lighting their fire. Then you see another fire being lit in a distance. And you see another fire. Basically, all these fires are being lit until finally you get to the fire beacon that's close to aid. And one of the characters, Aragorn, famous scene, he sees the fire being lit. He runs into the hall. He utters these lines, Gondor calls for aid. And the king says, and we will answer the call. Now, that's a great line. It's a great scene in the movie. But what sometimes is missed in our memories of this scene is a line uttered by another character named Gandalf, who's all the way back at the first beacon. Gandalf sees the fire being lit, and as soon as he sees the second one, so the message hasn't been fully delivered yet. He just sees the second one responding to the first. He knows the message has gotten out and it means help is on the way. And Gandalf has this great line where he looks at it, he breathes a sigh of relief, and he says, hope is kindled. Now here's my analogy. The miracles of Jesus and the Gospels are signs that the kingdom of God is coming.
So good.
They're a message that our full deliverance is on the way. Now, each healing of Jesus meets a genuine need. It's not for show. But it also communicates to those around that the message he was preaching of the coming of the kingdom of God was going to pass, right? It's coming. It's going to happen. So even John the Baptist, Matthew 11, John the Baptist is arrested. He's in prison. He has preached the coming of a Messiah who's going to cut down all the enemies of God. Jesus comes on the scene. He's doing all these things, but nothing's happening to the enemies of God, right? And at least the political enemies, the political structure. John sends messengers to him to simply ask, are you the one we were expecting, or should we be looking for another? And here's Jesus' response. He says, go back and tell John this, the blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the gospel is preached to the poor. In other words, you have the signs that the gospel is coming. And every one of these healings, Israel has called for aid, and God is answering that call in Jesus. The signs point to the kindling of our hope because they point to something greater beyond themselves. Now, wonders refer to simply something that inspires awe from those who experience it. A wonder is actually connected to where we get the word miracle, because miracle actually comes from the Latin for simply to wonder. When people experience a wonder or a miracle, they respond with astonishment, sometimes even fear.
Well, and I want to park here on miracles, because oftentimes, until this unpacking of healing, whenever we think about divine healing, we immediately associate with miracles. Can you sort of talk about that?
Yeah. Now, in the Bible, I want to stress there's more kinds of miracles than just healings. Yes. So a divine healing is a divine intervention for the sake of your body. Some miracles are divine interventions that happen outside of your body. So it might be miracles like a provision for food. So bread is provided or wine is provided at the wedding at Cana. It might be a miracle of protection. Peter is freed from prison. Everyone survives Paul's shipwreck. Sometimes there's miracles of revelation, like God passing by Moses, or the transfiguration of Jesus, or even dreams and visions that communicate the future, as with Joseph and Daniel. And I would even classify some miracles as very unique miracles of creation, like creation itself, we know first nothing, then something, the incarnation of Jesus, the Spirit overshadows Mary, or the resurrection.
So is what makes all of that list of miracles tied to a supernatural occurrence?
I would say yes, but I would also caution against the word supernatural, only because the biblical authors don't know what supernatural means, because the idea of natural laws don't exist yet. So when we use the word supernatural, if all we mean by that is it's something happening beyond what's expected by natural laws, that's fine. But some people in our world today take the word supernatural to mean that God is somehow acting against nature or against creation. All of nature is an act of God because God created it. So the work of God doesn't just fit in the category of supernatural, because nature is also God's work. It doesn't mean that if something's supernatural, God is somehow working against what he's created. What I like to call supernatural, I like really to prefer simply the term extraordinary, right? As opposed to something ordinary or something expected. A miracle is something that results from divine action breaking up the expected in our lives. A miracle is God's revelation of his will and power breaking into and disrupting our expectations of the ordinary.
Oh, that's good. So it's a miracle because we couldn't predict it or when it would occur, and we really can't humanly explain how it happened.
Well, I would say this, we couldn't predict it. We didn't predict it. But sometimes after the fact, we might have an explanation, because sometimes what makes it a miracle isn't that we can't explain the how, it's that we can't explain the why now. Because God works through nature, God can always do one thing that causes something else to happen. And when you look at it together, you're like, oh, I see how cause and effect worked here. But why did it happen now? The disease was healed because the body did this and that. But why did the body do this and that at this moment? Or let me give you a more biblical example. One of the most dramatic miracles in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is the parting of the Red Sea. And as soon as I say the Red Sea parted, a lot of people have in mind the movie 10 Commandments, where Moses, where Moses raises his staff and immediately the waters part. And that looks like a miracle. But in Exodus 14:21, that's not what happens. Moses stretches out his hand, and it says, the Lord sent an east wind that drove the sea back all night until the waters were divided. So it isn't just a matter of waters separating. It's a matter of wind hitting against them until a path is created. And someone might read that and say, aha, so if we can explain why the water is parted meteorologically, then it isn't a miracle. But I would ask, but why did it happen at just the time when they needed it to happen to get across the Red Sea? Sometimes the miracle isn't what we can't explain, but it's simply what we could not expect to have happened at the time that it did. What makes something miraculous is God's intervention into the ordinary to turn it extraordinary for his purposes. When we see a sign of God's work, when we wonder at what God has done, there's a sign and wonder. And in the book of Acts, Signs and wonders are always pointing us back to Jesus.
And so, yes, we believe in miracles. Yes, we believe in healings. Yes, we believe in the supernatural, and that God uses those to further the gospel, to point to redemption. Yet it's not always convincing. I mean, human nature, go back to the children of Israel. They saw a miracle every single day, yet they weren't very spiritually mature. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, a sign is always something that can be rejected because you don't have to accept what it points at or what it means.
Okay, that's
Just
good.
because you have a stop sign doesn't mean everyone's going to stop at that corner, right? Just because you have Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and another example, doesn't mean everyone who hears about that is going to accept Jesus. In fact, one of the craziest stories for me in the entire Gospel of John is a blink and you'll miss it line in John 12:10, where it's said that because many people were putting their faith in Jesus because of Lazarus, those who were plotting to kill Jesus were also planning to kill Lazarus. Lazarus was on a hit list. We sometimes miss this line. Lazarus was on a hit list solely for the fact that God raised him from the dead. And I asked myself, how evil do you have to be that the reason you want to kill someone is because God brought them back to life? That's how you're afraid of what that will mean to other people. Why would they do that? It's because of how badly this miracle of Jesus, which in the Gospel of John is the last sign, contested their worldview of what a Messiah would be, and they couldn't accept it as a work of God.
So what do you do if the reason that some won't see a miracle as a sign that fits into their worldview, then how can miracles be effective in evangelism?
Now, signs and wonders function as a way of breaking up someone's worldview by shaking them from the expectation of the ordinary, by pointing them in a certain direction when their worldview might be open to it. It doesn't mean that all signs and wonders and let me just stress this because I want to be careful. Just because something is a sign or a wonder doesn't mean that even we accept it as coming from God, right? When signs and wonders are mentioned in the book of Revelation, it's always attributed to the enemy who's doing signs and wonders to bring attention to the beast or the false prophet. When we see it as a sign and wonder, it's only because it's a sign pointing back to God. So even we don't think if it's something as a sign or wonder miraculous, we just accept it wholesale. It's a sign that points to God that comes from God. And if it points to worship of anything that's less than God, we know that it's not from God. But God will still use signs to get our attention. And if the end result of that sign is wonder from God, the sign and wonder from God, if the end result of that is the glory of God, the gospel of Jesus, and the good of God's people, we know that it's from God. And in the same way, and I want to stress this, because I'm kind of doing a sidetrack here, in Pentecostalism, we don't treat the act of divine healing as a sign that whatever was preached or taught around it was true. Miracles are not a litmus test for our preaching. They're an act of God for care and for glory. If someone is healed, it's because of the grace of God acting on their behalf that happened in light of their faith, or it may just be an act of a generous God to people who didn't even expect it. But it's not God's seal of approval on whatever was being taught or preached at the time. For example, there are people who are healed during snake handling services. But that's not a justification for handling snakes in a worship service. It's simply a result of people trusting in God while they handle snakes, and God responds to their faith, not the snakes. There are people who are healed in churches that teach some version of the prosperity gospel. The healing's not a result, is the result of God responding to their cry of need and faith, but it's not a stamp of approval on the message of prosperity. Just because God healed your cancer doesn't mean everybody gets a new car, because that's not what healing is a sign for. So even when it's God who is healing, and healing is the sign pointing back to the reality of the gospel, that's what we can trust in. But there will still be people who won't believe. In fact, I've had conversations with people who have seen miracles. You'll describe it. They'll tell you back what they saw that they can't explain, and you say to them, will you believe? And they'll say no. And you're like, why? And they're like, well, medical science just can't explain this yet. Or it's just a coincidence that this happened at this exact moment. Rather than God is at work, they remain in denial when it's a clear act of God because it points back to God.
Alan,
It's not just the miracle they can't accept, it's the God it points back to that they can't accept.
This is so rich. It's actually raising my faith to believe in what I articulate, that we have a miracle-working God, but to see that it's available through Christ, through the atoning work. So what is it within human nature that even when seeing the demonstration of the miraculous prevents them from acknowledging it's a miracle or from God?
Well, at a personal level, there's just something that prevents them from accepting God. And many times at a personal level, that just might be their own personal issue. I know of one atheist, and I'm not going to name him by name, though he's published this, who's been very honest and said, he's a well-known scholar, well-known philosopher, well-known atheist, who said the reason he can't believe in God is because he had an abusive childhood. And he cannot accept that there is a father out there that he could never get free from. And so he'll talk about, a cosmic authority problem that he just, and it's terrifying. So at a personal level, he struggles with that.
And I want to go off script here just for a minute. It's important for us as ministers of the gospel to create a healthy view of God the Father, because so many associate that relationship, to their earthly or biological, and that is abusive, that is dysfunctional. So I want to challenge our viewers, please, when presenting the gospel, when helping people to understand who God is, make sure that we're representing God in a very biblical, in a very accurate, in a very sovereign, holy way. Sorry.
No. In fact, it's how we represent God as a community.
There you go.
That makes the greatest impact. And I will say, sometimes the problem we have with miracles is not the miracle itself. It's that we have been inoculated from accepting what that miracle points to.